Welcome to the Cafe Culture podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
This event was recorded on the 1st of July 2013 when Lowri Bond discussed regenerating our towns and cities.
Thank you very much. So, I'm delighted to be here this evening. Thank you very much for coming along. As Esther mentioned, my current work is at Northern Architecture, and I've been there for about, well, actually nearly 10 years.
Can everyone hear? Perhaps if
Should I closer or further away? Closer?
Closer.
Right, okay.
Closer.
As you can see, I'm not a seasoned public speaker, so bear with me this evening. I've been at Northern Architecture for 10 years, and whilst working there, I've been involved in trying to bridge gaps and develop dialogues between ordinary people in very often ordinary yet extraordinary places with the people who in one way or another are involved in perhaps implementing some kind of change in those places, changes to the built environment usually, often involving quite large-scale regeneration schemes. And I'm very interested and very passionate about people's opportunity to get involved in those processes. I'm really interested in our relationship with places and our ability or sometimes lack of it to influence this kind of ongoing and dynamic process of development. So this evening I want to talk broadly about what I see as a kind of historical severing of our connection to placemaking. Because I think this leads to multiple and often complex problems in our towns and cities, and not least a kind of frequent cycle of redevelopment. What I want to do is explore and hopefully prompt some thought and discussion on why we seem to struggle to develop an approach that makes the process of changing or improving places a positive experience. Through my work, I often hear reference to loss and betrayal in the stories of people whose neighbourhoods or communities have undergone or are undergoing urban regeneration. In The Governance of Space, Jean Hillier's essay states, "Identities of self and place are intrinsically related. Moreover, identities of both are complex and dynamic." And she goes on to suggest that the importance of identity and this complexity is often overlooked or not recognised in traditional planning and decision-making processes, leading to the perpetuation of injustices. And our tendency, I'm happy to be challenged on this afterwards, but our tendency to repeat mistakes in urban planning and placemaking and to somehow sort of miss the human, social and cultural context of regeneration is what I would like to kind of open up for discussion this evening. And it was difficult for me to decide how to do this. But what I plumped on was first giving you a bit of a sort of whistle-stop tour of placemaking from its origins, in the hope that I can give you a backdrop to discuss this afterwards that isn't too sort of led by me. So, evidence of hearth building nearly 800,000 years ago is probably our earliest sign of home building. And it was to do with the use and control of fire for cooking, for keeping warm, and it was bound up with the process of sharing, safety, and with the development of social groups. One of the earliest known human shelters was found at Terre-Manta in France, and it dates back 400,000 years. And the site has evidence of multiple dwellings grouped together, and we can only assume that tribes or small communities worked together to build these places. And again, they were about warmth, safety, cooking, storage of materials. And then for hundreds of thousands of years following this, the types of shelter that we were building were as varied and unique as the environments in which they were being created. We'd have made homes from materials found nearby, from wood, animal skins, rock, mud, ice, straw, and they would have been made to hold on the sand or the clay or the rock or snow on which they were being built. Yet they would also have had to have been packed away and moved when needed. Fast forward to the Neolithic period, between 4000 and 2000 BC, and we were using even more sophisticated timber frame constructions. We'd started to build with wattle and daub, thatch was being used. Homes and social groups were being built with more permanence in mind. Communities were clearing woodland, keeping livestock, sharing resources and trading. Land partitioning, and for the first time the concept of land ownership would have come about. But these small settlements with population growth were proliferating rather than growing. Communities remained small. They were probably around 200, 300 people. And at the stone-constructed Skara Brae in the Orkneys, dated around 3500 BC, even furniture like shelves and dressers and cupboards were built into these stone constructions. This village even had a drainage system, and each dwelling had an early form of toilet, which I find incredible. During the Middle Ages, modern urban civilization emerged. In the 16th century, London had begun to experience symptoms of urbanisation that's familiar to us today. Constraints on space, rise in land values, and homes were being built up to 3 floors. Warmth and light in homes were synonymous with wealth. And although glass had been produced at Jarrow and Monk Wearmouth as early as 680 AD, glazed windows only became widespread in ordinary homes in the mid-17th century. A hearth tax was introduced in the 1660s, followed by the perhaps more known about window tax. But in 1851, the same year that Paxton's Crystal Palace was built, the window tax was repealed, and along with the abolition of tax on glass production, the scale of domestic use of glass really started to make an impact on the amount of light that was brought into our homes. Then, in the 18th century, of course, came industrialisation. And with it, urbanisation exploded throughout the UK. Towns growing rapidly, subsuming surrounding villages to support the Industrial Revolution. Brick replaced stone as a cheaper, quicker building material. Rows of small, tightly packed brick terraces rolled out across great swathes of our urban core of UK cities. Rural-urban migration increases at this time, and we are transformed from a nation of farmers to a nation of factory workers. And this, I think, represents the first huge shift away from people building with their own resources for their own needs to landowners and industrialists building quickly and cheaply to house their workers. Demands on space and the need for a substantial labour force increased during the 19th century. Urban housing comes to represent and reflect status and class much more than ever. Overcrowding, poverty, ill health, crime, they become symptoms of urban life. Engels' horror in observing industrialised cities in 1845 writes of Manchester of the irregular cramming together of dwellings, of ways which defy all rational plan, of the tangle in which they are crowded literally one on top of the other, every scrap of space left by the old way of building has been filled up and patched over until not a foot of land is left to be further occupied. And then in the latter part of the 19th century, the overcrowding, the poverty, the impact on public health is so acute that the city and its areas of slum housing come to be seen as a problem that needs to be solved. In 1898, Ebenezer Howard writes Garden Cities of Tomorrow. At its basis is the idea that we provide highly organised new towns on the outskirts of overcrowded cities, which bring the best of rural and urban together and provide a healthy, green, prosperous and pleasant environment for living. Howard also takes the idea of Paxton's Crystal Palace and he puts it at the centre of his plan. It's a focal point for the new community, a meeting point representing light, optimism and shared civic pride. It's revolutionary in its thinking for the time. Howard lays the foundations for modern urban planning, zoning, green belting and so on. And he lives to see his ideas put into practice at Letchworth and Welwyn Garden cities. So in the early 20th century, urban planning is born. William Hesketh Lever, founder of Port Sunlight, which you can tell has been influenced by Howard just by the name. He was driven by recognition that decent homes and a strong community make for a happy, healthy, prosperous workforce. And he sets up the first department of civic design at Liverpool in 1909. Later, in 1946, the New Towns Act leads to the first wave of overspill towns being built. But the ones that followed Letchworth and Welwyn embodied only a few of Howard's original aspirations. Slum clearance programmes had been stalled by the First World War, but they'd begun to get off the ground in the 1930s and they continued right up to the 70s. This, alongside housing lost during World War II and coupled with rapid and unprecedented population increases, lead to a housing crisis in the UK. And this required a new, radical solution. Initially, prefab housing, of course, met the immediate demand during the 50s. But by the 60s, urban planners were starting to think more radically about the way in which our homes and cities should be provided. Vast swathes of terraces were swept away in cities, such as Liverpool, Manchester, Newcastle, Sheffield, Glasgow, to make way for housing estates of high-rise blocks of flats, deck-access flats, alongside low-rise maisonettes and houses. Not only did this sweep away the traditional urban layouts and house typologies in order to free up open space, light, air, these estates also used new building technology and materials, often including concrete, steel and glass, and they had a new, simple, clean aesthetic. Notable examples, of course, include Park Hill in Sheffield, the Hume Crescents in Manchester, and closer to home and more current, the Chandler's estate in Gateshead, which is currently being demolished. And they're to name but a few. And these new housing estates gave occupants often their first experience of heating and indoor toilets. The 1960s also saw the second and third wave of new towns, and with them more modernist ideals prevailed. And this was a time of optimism. There was unprecedented prosperity and employment, and there was a cross-party political commitment to the provision of social housing based on need rather than on means. The Parker-Morris report of 1961, called Homes for Today and Tomorrow, represented a landmark in the design of public authority housing. And it recommended two major aspirations. It was to provide more space for living and better heating, with a focus on the need for privacy, but perhaps with less emphasis on the relationship between interior private spaces and the longer-term use and maintenance for the social and shared spaces beyond. And while intentions were brave, this process was still one of vast and rapid change, with large parts of the city and people's identities being swept away. It was still a process being done to people rather than with people. And after a honeymoon period where people were bowled over by the relative luxury of their homes, the shine soon seemed to fade, and people reminisced about the close social networks that had existed in the old neighbourhoods. At this time, increasing numbers of women were also moving away from their role in the home and into work. Then the 1970s saw the rise of the volume house builder with the success of Barratt Homes, who provided private affordable starter homes that were launched through major national advertising campaigns, if you remember the Barratt man in his helicopter. And this heralded a renewed aspirational dimension to the home, and the idea of home ownership and the housing market became a cornerstone in the British economy. And here I want to talk just a little bit about planning. Peter Hall writes in Cities for Tomorrow that around 1955, city planning at last became legitimate, but in doing so began to sow the seeds of its own destruction. It split into two camps, one in the schools of planning, increasingly and exclusively concerned with theory, the other in the offices of local government and consultants, concerned with the everyday business of planning in the real world. I mention this because he then goes on to suggest that this break has since undermined planning's legitimacy, and that the disconnect between planning as a way to make the world and people's lives a better place, and planning being seen as this clunky bureaucratic system that serves political or capitalist agendas. And as a result, we see today, as we did in the 80s, planning being undermined as a practice and being vulnerable to reform on the whims of government, especially if it's seen to get in the way of short-term economic gain. In the 80s, two significant policy changes also alter our attitudes to social housing. Under the Conservatives, the social housing system moves from a needs to a means-based system. And Margaret Thatcher introduces right to buy. And this makes housing not just a class issue, but also an issue of status and an issue of values. And the rhetoric surrounding the right to buy policy suggests that people who work hard and they make their own way in the world, they deserve to own their own home. By implication, if you are socially housed, you haven't succeeded, and that your status is therefore lower. In the 90s, recession hits. Globalisation and global media makes the identity of cities and external perceptions and image all the more important. And our new Labour, a new millennium regeneration response is to reinvent city centres with landmark buildings, investment in culture and sport, and especially in the north, in former industrial cities, try to shake off any vestiges of their past as poor, grimy cities, of outposts of being cultural deserts. And they try to reinvent themselves in the void following the collapse of industry and manufacture. Housing values also bounce back in most parts of the UK. And Sarah Beanie, Kevin MacLeod, Kirsty Allsop, and that other guy that no one can remember his name, they gain a niche celebrity status through the business of advising ordinary people on the buying and selling of property. Also around this time, a funky shoe designer challenges a volume house builder to do better, to use more distinctive and innovative housing design. And the result on the banks of the Tyne is a little like Cinderella's slipper. It's pretty indeed, but it's far too small for most people. Meanwhile, the government addresses areas of stubborn housing market failure in the early new millennium. In Newcastle, similarly to Liverpool and other cities, plans to demolish thousands of homes are met with resistance and strong feelings of betrayal and mistrust. Some other areas, in contrast, plan to implement smaller improvement schemes and pockets of redevelopment. After years of wrangling, Scotswood, for example, goes ahead with quite a large-scale redevelopment scheme. But this is stalled by another market crash and deep recession, and it leaves unused waste ground and rows of streets of boarded-up houses in the middle of many neighbourhoods, not just Scotswood. And that brings us to today, where primary school children living surrounded by major earthworks and machinery in the westerly part of the Scotswood site will actually be adults before they see their neighbourhood populated by homes and people again. And 1960s housing estates, particularly in Gateshead at the moment, continue to be demolished. So, what does this story tell us? My understanding is that the origins of house building and placemaking are linked inextricably with the development of society and citizenship, and that it's a socio-cultural process that we perhaps ought to be better connected to. But since the Industrial Revolution, we've sort of lost our way in our relationship with the production of places. And despite the vast improvements made to the quality and standard of living, driven by a social agenda in the early planning movement, the process of placemaking, particularly housing provision, has become an economic and political process that most people have little control over, other than the more wealth and privilege that we have, the more choice and power we have in the market. Yet it seems to me that we're no less connected to home and place as being a factor in our individual and collective sense of identity and worth. And there are movements towards a different approach. Co-housing, self-build, the slow cities movement, they are gaining interest, but they are yet to become mainstream. And are they the answer? David Harvey invites us to think about cities as a process, not a thing. But he also warns us, one of the aspects of much contemporary debate, which I find particularly striking, is the tendency, when faced with all sorts of difficulty, again and again, is to reach into this bag called community, on the assumption that community is going to save us all. Community, endowed with salving powers, is perceived as capable of redeeming the mess which we are creating in our cities. He goes on. A lot of community construction projects are in the end a recipe for isolation. They isolate groups from the city as a whole. They move them towards a fragmented notion of what the urban process is all about. So, I want to open up the floor to you now. And I want to ask, and I'd like us to discuss, what can be done to reconnect people to this process of placemaking? And should we even try? Thank you.
Culture North East is supported by Newcastle University, Peels and the British Science Association. We're also supported by Ginger's Cafe in Dance City, who host the events.